Hey everybody, it's Tom here, and today I'm looking at Trials Rising on console, from PS4 to Xbox One to, of course, that Switch version. Now, Switch, obviously a very unique proposition given it's the first time the series has landed on a handheld if we're overlooking the mobile versions. And with that, Red Lynx has kind of adapted it in a way that makes sense given it's a port of the PS4 and Xbox One versions where the development clearly took a focus. And while it's great to see on the console, it fits into a band of Switch ports where the cutbacks are quite extreme in cases, but the gameplay is fundamentally intact so long as you can accept a 30 FPS baseline for performance. More on that later, but for now I figured I'd go through the consoles in turn just to give you the stats, just to get you a sense of what to expect in resolution, and then we'll go into frame rate and the visual comparisons with Switch. So first up, it's got to be said, this game is absolutely a blast to play, full of inventiveness and great ideas, to such a point that almost every level feels like it deserves a spoiler alert or something. It's kind of a miracle that it's landed on Switch at all, with all this in mind. There's a whole swathe of games like this, kind of technical challenges, but I think with Switch you've got to accept that there's going to be a lot of cutbacks. So if we kick off with the native resolutions, here we have the base PlayStation 4. This is running at a native 1920 by 1080, much like the last version of the game, and generally speaking, image quality looks great. Now, one thing to note about this is I've noticed more in the way of aliasing than the other console versions. I'm not sure if it's because it's the only version here to not have some form of consistent scaling to another resolution. It's generally 1080p, and so it's a perfect pixel match for a full HD display, but sometimes I do see a lot of raw edges. Not that you'll really notice when the game's moving this fast at 60 FPS. Now, if we move to the base Xbox One, this is where you'll see image quality inevitably take a downturn. I've noticed numbers around 900p. One figure came in at 1512 by 850, just shy of 900p, but generally it's in that ballpark. It's a visible downgrade, but not to a ridiculous extent. In fact, if we move over to Switch now, I think you can see this is where the degradation in image quality really starts to take notice. So we're just looking at docked here. We focused on the docked versus portable play in our last analysis on the beta, and in that case we saw dynamic scaling from 720p on the handheld mode, and it was more or less fixed at 720p. Now I've had more time with Switch now to really go into depth with what's going on, and it is a dynamic scaler on the docked mode as well. It's much rarer, and generally speaking it holds at 720p, but I've noticed it scaling, say, at the base of this ramp as we go down. You see all those wood boards down there start to get a bit blurrier, the definition's less defined, and it's running at about 725 by 408. So it is possible, and you'll notice a dip in image quality, kind of a seamless transition, but besides that, it's a really solid showing, and given the Xbox One version is running at 900p, I guess relatively speaking it makes sense Switch is going for the next rung down at 720 and dynamic scaling up and down from that. So that's how they pan out. Now if we look at the opposite end of the spectrum, we have PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. So if we focus on Pro first, I've noticed a range of numbers when pixel counting this one. It can go from 2080 by 1170 up to 3200 by 1800. So 1800p is the max bounds, or at the very least the number that the game is trying to resolve to from lower resolution. So there could be some reconstruction here, but from what I've seen it does seem like there is a lower resolution in effect, and it's generally the case that I've seen numbers below 1800p. And moving to Xbox One X, we've got a similar story. It's 3840 by 2160, so a full 4K in the best case, usually when stood still or in moments where there's not too much going on screen. But then it can dip, and I've noticed numbers like 2880 by 1620, which is basically, if you're looking at the horizontal or vertical axis, a 75% scale of a full 4K. Generally speaking, I've been happy with both, but it is obvious, playing right in front of a 4K set, that the Xbox One X version is the best looking one, the clearest, the sharpest, and I think it's fair to say also the best performing, as we'll see later on. Now let's go to visual comparisons, because this is something we didn't really have time to touch on with the beta, and I think the most exciting part of this is to see what has really been done to the Switch version to make it run, to make it possible on a handheld. Between all the other consoles, the visual feature sets are very similar besides resolution, so we can kind of put that aside. PS4 versus PS4 Pro, Xbox One versus X, there's not much going between them, and it's mainly the final image quality that's going to divide them. And I've picked the PS4 Pro version as a comparison point just to show generally one of the better versions out there. It is very obvious what's missing. We're going for docked capture on Switch, and it's pretty much a game of spot the difference. The most notable downgrade is surprisingly on the first level, the Breaking Bad stage, where there's a massive dust cloud leading into the distance. If you look closely at the slowed down footage, I've slowed it to 33%, it is likely because of the stripping back in object detail. They've pretty much removed a lot of the trees, the objects, and the spectators in the background, which are on PS4. You can catch a glimpse of it just ahead of the dust cloud, but it may have been a artistic choice to just avoid showing how barren it is in the background, just to fill in the space. And what we're left with is a completely different looking level. Now, this isn't the case for most stages, and I've generally seen shadows are the thing that are missing in some stages, others not. Basically, from the bike itself or environment shadows, they can be stripped out entirely on some levels, while they're reinstated in others. So clearly the adjustments to Switch's visuals are done on a level by level basis, and to me that suggests that there's been a lot of tailoring just to get this game running at a stable frame rate, and that's involved going quite deep. Now surprisingly, looking to the later levels, it's amazing how much is intact. Shadows are usually the thing to be cut, but overall you're going to notice objects and spectators are just trimmed back, so it's not too bad overall. Now texture mapping and texture filtering are definitely pruned back as well on Switch, but in the main I haven't really noticed it in motion. It moves too quickly, and it's only right at the end of the stage where you've come to a catastrophic finish that you'll get a close-up of the ground and you'll see, oh yeah, there it is, there's a very low resolution texture map. But besides that, I think it gets away with it. It's just the very unusual case of the first level that suggests you're maybe not going to get the full package. In that case, it does look like a completely different game, and there may be more like that. But for most of the levels I've played, it's actually doing a pretty decent rendition of what we're getting on PS4 Pro. There are a few other discrepancies here, like there's no ambient occlusion on Switch, which is instated on PS4 and Xbox One. It's a very dithered approach to the effect on the other consoles, and to be honest, I don't really miss it. I've got to say, it looks fine just without it. So in summary, Switch runs with a pruned back resolution of 720p dynamic, dialed back object settings, shadows, textures, texture filtering, pretty much the works, but it still looks great on its own terms. I think if you played Switch on its own, you'd be happy with it. It's only when you see these side-by-sides here that you realise really what you're missing. Anyway, so to move on, there's another point here which is about how the game actually plays. This isn't just about frame rate, it's about the actual controls themselves. Now, if you've played the Switch version, you'll know the triggers are only digital, there's no analog feedback on them, which has a kind of impact on a game like this where, much like Rocket League for example, you can't feather it, you can't modulate the acceleration. And to be honest, it wouldn't usually be such a big deal, but this game places such an emphasis, even in the tutorials, on not hammering the accelerator and kind of being careful and navigating the course by lowering your speed. So the ability to actually play the game is hampered a bit by those Joy-Cons and even the Pro controller. Now there is a workaround. You can just use the right stick, which is obviously an analog control. You can press it in the up and right directions to get acceleration and back to brake, and that works fine. But surprisingly, there's another option, which is if you plug a GameCube controller into your Switch, obviously through a hub, and obviously while it's docked, you can actually use the analog triggers on that controller to make it work. So there is a workaround, a little bit of an odd one, but it is there if you want it. Now, looking to performance. Now, since we looked at the beta, not much has really changed. This game still has frame pacing issues while docked. It's just a 30 FPS line. Some levels have frame pacing stutters worse than others. Generally speaking, I've noticed it more often than not. It's just a bit of a shame, but potentially it can be fixed. If the beta is anything to go by, the portable mode has less of it, and it runs more evenly at 30 FPS with no fluctuations to 16 milliseconds and 50. So there is potential there. Now, what we haven't seen before is the alternative on the other consoles, which is sobering, because ultimately this is a 60 FPS game, definably by pretty much every version of the game that's appeared on console so far. So that's pretty much what we get on PS4, Xbox One and the enhanced consoles. What is worth pointing out is there are a few stutters, a few hitches, very noticeable ones. It can really take you out of the moment and you lose your momentum genuinely at the top of a jump. And it happens more so, I've noticed, on PS4 and Xbox One, where there is also tearing to accompany it. So there is an adaptive VSync on those consoles, more obviously kicking in across the whole screen. So it is a bit of an issue, more than I'd expected going in, and it kind of has to be fixed. Now I've noticed this happens variably. There can be whole levels which run without an issue, and then you can play that level again and it'll have those stutters. So there is a suggestion it's to do with the networking side and feeding back to the servers, like your progress. Now if we move over to the PS4 Pro and X, PS4 Pro has the same issue, but I've noticed far less stuttering. It seems to avoid that visual artifact and just has a hitch every now and then. Fortunately, the Xbox One X version seems to ride through it mostly clear in this respect, so it's pretty much hitch free for the most part I've played, and so along with the resolution, I think you're going to get away with the best frame rate of the bunch on that console. These aren't conventional frame rate drops, of course. There's nothing on the renderer side that I can see that's really causing any issue from about the first 2 hours I've played on each console. It's really just these stutters. Maybe it's an asset streaming thing, maybe it's a networking thing. It gives me hope that it can be fixed down the line because it is an obvious problem and I've noticed a few people mention it. Anyway, that's about covers all the bases here. Again, it does feel like development did start with PS4 and Xbox One in mind, and only after that fact was Switch really factored in, but actually I'd quite like to see what would have been possible if there was, say, a Switch version built from the ground up, or even taking the older 360 versions, last gen versions even, which were optimized to run at 60 FPS on older hardware, and how that might have run on Switch. But still, what we've got is pretty impressive in the same way so many ports to Switch are. So while it is a very different power spec machine, and while it doesn't target 60 FPS, it's still a lot of fun to play in its own terms. So that'll have to do for this quick look at Trials Rising. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to give a like or subscribe to our channel. And of course, hit the bell to get notifications as any video land. Also, we have this video on our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.